World War III is here, but it's not being fought with nuclear weapons. It's being fought with influence. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. World War III isn't some far-off nightmare. It's been waged by China for decades. China is the only country fighting a truly 21st century war. Their weapons aren't guns or bullets or even nuclear weapons. Their weapon is influence, being bought with money and technology. And in this war, we're all soldiers. How close is China to winning? And when will the United States realize it's already at war? Joining me today is retired Air Force Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He recently wrote this book, Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. It's basically the playbook of how China waged an unrestricted war against the United States.
Great to be back.
So, for decades now, the U.S. and China have been involved in this strategic cooperation. And as promised, China's become a liberal democracy, correct?
Oh, that's so true. And that's why the people of Hong Kong are protesting right now so that they can actually move into the mainland China and join this wonderful, free and great society that Xi Jinping
I believe
has built.
Taiwan is trying to do the same thing.
The same thing. In fact, they're pushing Hong Kongese out of the way so they can get into mainland faster.
And over feet. So tell us a bit about your book.
So the whole idea behind the book was to get out as fast as I could everything I'd learned working in the Defense Department and the State Department and the White House over the last 5 or 6 years, understanding what the Chinese Communist Party was doing to our country, because quite frankly, now within D.C. the government gets the joke. So within the executive branch, we understand the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party has, not just for our economy, but also for our democracy. And in the Hill, on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, they understand that. Who doesn't understand it, quite frankly, because most Americans don't really understand what China is in terms of, Chinese Communist Party's power to control the entire society, is the American people. And so the idea was to get this information to the American people so they could understand not only what was going on in terms of the Chinese Communist Party, but why there was this, essentially unspecified angst about what's going on with our own society in terms of the ability to deliver on the promise of, a better, a more perfect union.
Well, so my question is this just an issue of China outcompeting the U.S. on an even playing field, or is something else going on?
No, first of all, there's no even playing field. When we talk about international economics, the word we use is free trade. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that's based on an idea of market-based approaches to economics, and China is anything from a market-based economy. In fact, they have done, especially since Xi Jinping has come into control the Chinese Communist Party, they've slowly consolidated the power of the state-owned enterprises within China, so that the Chinese Communist Party actually had more power over the economy. Not only they've done that, but they've essentially decapitated the leadership of a lot of the private companies within China, so HNA, Anbang, Alibaba. They've taken out the billionaires that had founded those companies and essentially so that the Chinese Communist Party could retake control of those companies as well. Recently, they just sent a bunch of government officials to work in companies so they had even more control over what was going on in the economy. So everything that they said that they were going to do in the WTO, everything that we believe in terms of free trade, and a level playing field, they don't absolutely agree with at all.
So the Chinese Communist Party isn't into the free market?
Well, of course, Xi Jinping will go to Davos, where everybody will gently clap when he says we need to keep globalization going, we need to collaborate. But in fact, no, they're into continuously growing the Chinese economy for the purpose of maintaining legitimacy so the Chinese people don't overthrow them for being despotic totalitarians.
Well, so I know there are people who will say, like, is this really just an issue of the United States losing its position of global dominance? And they would say, like, they don't really care whether it's the United States or China that's the global superpower.
Well, so, I mean, I think the NBA offers a good example of what that means for a democratic society, and that is the institutions of your society, whether they be political, academic, corporate, or financial, are in league with the Chinese Communist Party. So if the NBA can basically come very close to firing a general manager for tweeting something like support democracy in Hong Kong, then you understand the power that the Chinese Communist Party has over the entire system. When I was at the White House, I would call lawyers, think tanks, and say, hey, I need help either exposing what the Chinese are doing or come up with policy options that we can actually use to stop what they're doing. And they would all come back and say, sorry, we can't help because we don't want to anger our Chinese funders or customers. And so it's pervasive throughout our society, and quite frankly, the leaders of these institutions know it, but they're under the mistaken belief that embracing the Chinese Communist Party will somehow unlock this magical move towards democracy. So the idea of open markets leading wealth to wealth and wealth leading to democracy drives them to say, okay, I'm going to have the same worldview as Xi Jinping, only the worldview that he has and the worldview that our leaders have are completely counter to each other. Because if you read document number 9, which I know you have, you understand that rather than the Bill of Rights, they believe in the anti-Bill of Rights. And in fact, they want to suppress and destroy the Bill of Rights because they see it as a challenge to their continued rule.
So basically these, like American companies and think tanks, their idea is we will make China more free and democratic by imposing self-censorship in the United States.
Well, they've been told that. And so what we do is we incentivize them to kind of do that kind of behavior. So for instance, with MSCI All World Index going from 0 to 20% weighting in Chinese equities, what that does is take our retirement funds over to China to help invest in the Belt and Road Initiative or Made in China 2025.
You're talking about U.S. pensions being vested in China.
U.S. pensions funds. But at the same time, the Securities and Exchange Commission, who's responsible for ensuring that there's a level playing field for the U.S. Stockholder, allows Chinese companies not to abide by audit requirements or transparency requirements. Now, why is that? Why does Intel have to have a 10Q and a 10K, a quarterly statement and an annual statement? Because the SEC forces them to. But why doesn't Alibaba, who's really a Cayman Island company, and you don't know who owns the assets? Why aren't they required to do the same thing? Well, because there's this belief that if we just gave them a little bit of a good deal or a benefit, that they will, again, open up and become democracies. But of course, all the Chinese Communist Party does is take this policy and say, let's take as much money out of the system as we can so that we can keep this thing going.
Sort of the idea that China is this poor developing country, and as Joe Biden said, they're not a competition for the United States.
They're not a problem, folks.
So how widespread is Chinese money in the United States?
Oh, it's in the university system. Right now, so what's happened since the National Security Strategy in 2017, we've started to focus more on foreign agent registrations, so FAR registrations. You're starting to see now, if you go and look at those online, you can see, literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars pouring in from China to pay former congressmen, former senators that are essentially lobbying on Capitol Hill. All of these Chinese language media companies that are delivering Chinese language media content in the United States are having to register as foreign agents. And you're starting to get a real idea of how entrenched they are in our system. Of course, you can also look at the think tanks today, like the major think tanks in Washington, D.C. Look on the boards of those think tanks and look at their relationships to the Chinese Communist Party, and you realize that nearly every institution, major institution that we would count on to uphold the democratic principles of our free society have essentially created these economic and financial relationships with China. Now, did they go out and seek these out, or did China come? There's a little bit of both, quite frankly. I see there's a desire on the part of business in the United States to prevent conflict, and they think that if they're over talking to the Chinese Communist Party, that somehow they will create this connection that will make them not aggressive or want to have conflict. But of course, it just shows a lack of knowledge of how the Chinese Communist Party thinks about competition, it thinks about warfare, it thinks about warfare in ways that are completely different from the United States.
I think it's very interesting in your book how you frame it like China is the only country fighting a 21st century war.
Yeah, we talk about World War III, and when is it going to happen? You know, what's going to be the catalyst, and you know, how is it going to play out?
Flying.
Nuclear bombs flying, and you know, it's going to start, you know, with a biological agent that's released in some city, or there's all kinds of these scenarios that we have war games in the military and talk about and try to think about how war is going to change in the future. Meanwhile, it's being waged for decades in our neighborhoods, and so you know we're programmed in the military to fight abroad, to fight outside the borders, because we think, well, if we protect America from abroad, then we don't have to worry about it being at home. But what we fail to recognize is that globalization in the internet brought the adversary right into, you know, our television, you know, in our home.
Or the internet. We don't watch TV
or the
anymore.
internet. And so we're off defending, you know, our families, and our families are slowly being influenced by these economic, financial, and informational ties.
Well, so in the book, you really make it out that China has it in for the United States. Why is that?
Well, they have it in for the Constitution, because if you read document number 9, it really talks about those ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom from oppression. This real idea that you can make your own future is antithetical to the desires of the Chinese Communist Party, which is to maintain its totalitarian rule over China. And so one of the things they recognized during the Tiananmen massacre is this is a very viral idea. Once it gets instantiated, you can't stop it. And so you have to inoculate the society. The way you inoculate the society is you teach them from kindergarten, every single grade level, about the importance of the Chinese Communist Party, how the West is evil, how the Japanese are evil, and how we've had this century of humiliation. And then you bombard them. First of all, you protect them with a great firewall. Then you bombard them with media and social media, patriotic education. You've got an app now that watches you while you watch it. And you have to learn, you know, everything you can about the Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, all that's been curated to take out any sort of history that would give you some kind of counter-narrative that says, hey, Mao killed tens of millions of people, and you know, we had this thing called the Cultural Revolution where we broke all ties with the past, and history's been rewritten. None of this that the Chinese people know. Take that back. The ones that know are the ones that are tasked to censor the people on social media. So it's interesting to see those people when they learn about the Tiananmen Square. Some people interviewed them and they said, well, did you go home and tell your family? Oh, no, I don't want to start rumors. So, I mean, it's really interesting how, by the way, that model of teaching the censors what to censor is exactly replicated in Facebook. It's replicated in Twitter. So the business models of the open data system are replicated in the West and in China. In the West, they're for profit, ostensibly, but in China, they're for profit and control. And what's happening is there's a convergence in these two models, and particularly that's what 5G is about. It's about converging these two models and about the China's model becoming ascendant in that competition, because you know, the 4G world was about the smartphone. The 5G world is really about the Internet of Things. So rather than saying, hey, I want to get on my phone and get an Uber, you walk out the front door of this building and you say Uber, and it shows up because the camera picked up your face. Now, all of that data of everything that you do walking around the city is going to be controlled by perhaps an American tech company, but I would venture to say it may be Baidu, Alibaba, or Tencent that is taking that back to China. Now, you might say, oh, this is complete bogus, you know, stuff made up by a general that, wants to, get everybody worked up.
I was going to say it was uber terrifying.
Well, it is uber terrifying, but the fact is, Samantha Hoffman, a researcher at Australian Strategic Policy Institute, recently came out with a paper called Engineering Global Consent, and it talks about Global Tone Communication Corporation, GTCOM for short. Now, what does GTCOM do? It does translation services in 65 different languages. It labels itself a big data and AI company. And in order to do translation in 65 different languages, it collects 2 to 3 petabytes of data per year. Now, the interesting thing about Global Tone Communication Corporation is it's jointly owned by the Ministry of Finance and the propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party. So the 2 to 3 petabytes of data, and this is, by the way, on their own website, goes to the intelligence arm of the People's Liberation Army and the propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is what we face in the 5G world. The Chinese Communist Party really were smart about this because they saw the United States dominate, the 4G world by coming up with a platform, the smartphone, and being the second country in the world to build the network. The 5G network is the platform itself. So the smartphone goes away, the camera that you talk into when you go out the front door, and all of these machines, the Internet of Things, becomes the things that collect data about you to make your life more convenient. But it also makes it very easy to know exactly who you are and what you do.
So China, if this technology is built by Chinese companies, that's the Chinese Communist Party having an all-seeing eye globally.
Well, that's the brilliance of what they did, because now companies like AT&T and Verizon, who've not instituted or given one recommendation to 3GPP, which is the industry standards making body for 5G, is completely dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. Not only the standards for 5G, but the underlying patented technology for 5G. So if you're Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, or ZTE, it really doesn't matter. If you're building a 3GPP network, you're building a Chinese network.
So China has, if this works, China will have successfully taken over the world without anybody knowing, without a single shot being fired.
And it's really because we in the West stopped investing in ourselves. We stopped investing in infrastructure. We stopped investing in our industrial base. We stopped investing in STEM education. We stopped investing in basic science research and development. We just stopped. We stopped, taking care of our own people.
So how is it that you have figured out all of this, and yet there's still the think tanks, business leaders, politicians, Democrats and Republicans? How are you seeing this, but they aren't?
So I had a team, and I was a group of fellow officers in the Pentagon from 2014 to 2016 that really started to uncover this. And frankly, the Defense Department decided to put some resources to it, and we started this office called the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis so that we could get analysis on what was going on, and so it's just spread. Once you start to peel back the layers of the onion, you start to realize that it's, quite frankly, pervasive across all society. And so once you start on that path, I learned something every single day about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing and how deep their infiltration in democratic societies goes. But you have to, it's almost like you remember the scene in The Matrix where you're going to take the red pill, or you're going to take the blue pill.
I'm very familiar with
Most people want the blue pill. They don't want the red pill. And because if you take the red pill, you have to realize that it's time to stand up and fight for the survival of freedom and the United States.
So clearly Democrats and Republicans have dropped the ball on this. Is the solution going to take Democrats and Republicans working together?
Oh, absolutely.
It's never going to happen. We're screwed.
Just like in the Soviet Union. The good thing is, I walk the halls of Congress, and the one issue that you can get congressmen and senators to agree on is we need to do something about the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think once Americans understand, we're a free country and people can think for themselves. Once they're presented with logical, fact-based arguments that aren't, covered with a smokescreen, which is what the stealth war is about. It's about hiding everything that they do. Then they can begin to make their own decisions. They can say, hey, we don't have to send our retirement funds to China. We don't have to not have tariffs on Chinese products which are basically designed to balance a playing field. We don't have to have our kids be censored in our own universities because we have so many Chinese students and we have these Confucius Institutes and Chinese student associations which are designed to stifle speech in our university system. We can take back control of our country.
So you say your book is not to sound an alarm, but it's a call to arms.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that if America is to survive, and what I mean by that is if it's going to continue as a democratic constitutional republic, then Americans are going to have to stand up and fight for it. It's not going to be given to you free. It's not going to be handed to your children or grandchildren for free. You know, our founding fathers had to fight for it. You know, along the 240 plus years of our existence, people had to stand up and fight. The fight is just different this time. You don't have to go, you know, pick up a weapon and go fight in some faraway land. You have to fight for democracy right here at home by recognizing that democracy here is under assault. Look at what happened with the NBA. It's clear as day if you choose to look at it.
So in a way, we're already in World War III?
We are in World War III, and you are in the front lines. I am now in the front lines. When I had a uniform on, I was, you know, working in the government. I wasn't really paying attention, but now I'm fully woke, and I'm taking up the battle cry, and this is one of the ways that I'm doing it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for writing an incredible book. Once again, the book is Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. We'll put a link in the description below. Be sure to check it out. It's a great book. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to the battle.